Hello and welcome again to Stand in the Gap. I'm your host, Sam Rohrer, and I'm going to be joined again by my co-host, Isaac Crockett. As we air this program, we're just weeks away from the 17th anniversary of 9/11, the day that has gone down in infamy as the most deadly attack on U.S. soil, killing 2,996 people, injuring over 6,000 and causing at least $10 billion in infrastructure and property damage. For those of us who are alive and old enough to remember, we can likely recall the exact place we were standing or sitting when we first heard the news of that American Airlines Flight 11 flying directly into the trade towers in Manhattan. Over the course of that day and the days that followed, we shared the collective violation of having our security shattered. And immediately, most people in this nation knew they needed God. Church attendance surged. Prayer meetings sprang up across our land as our people, for a while, forgot their petty differences and became united as Americans. But others wondered where God was in this tragedy, and they ran from Him. Yet we know from so many who've experienced great hardship and loss that even in the midst of tragedy, and in this tragedy in particular, that if we look, we can find the fingerprints of a loving God reaching out in mercy to all people, welcoming them to come to Him in repentance. Because there's so much to remember about that day and to encourage us on this day, on the next two programs, we're going to reflect back not only on the tragedy and the shock of September 11, 2001, but we're going to look beyond to the lessons for us today. Our theme, 9/11 Remembered. God's fingerprints of love in the midst of tragedy. And as always on this program, we try to take the large issues of the day, the transcending issues that affect our culture and the minds and the hearts of the American people, the ones that seem to divide us and seem to have no answer. We're going to approach the problem or the issue from what we refer to as a biblical worldview, from God's view as creator and man as created in God's image, but then fallen due to sin. We're going to examine the issue and then focus on God's glorious plan of redemption through Jesus Christ, that when we agree with Him, we can be healed and united through the love of Jesus Christ. So if you want to know the truth, if you want a solution that's guaranteed to work, if you want to know what God thinks, stay with us for the next 30 minutes as together we walk through the darkness of today's seemingly unsolvable dilemmas into the light and the freedom of moral truth. Our special guest today is a person who can testify to the gracious hand of God as he should have been on American Airlines Flight 11, which crashed into the first tower. In fact, this man was to have been the pilot on that very flight on that fateful day. But God reached down and put His fingerprints on this pilot and divinely delivered him. His name is Dr. Steve Scheibner, pilot, pastor, author, and speaker. We're going to talk with Steve in just a moment, but first let's watch this short clip of the last 1 minute of the recorded conversation between Betty Ong, American flight attendant on that flight, and the control tower just before the plane that Steve Scheibner was going to fly, and just before that plane struck the trade tower, killing all aboard, and beginning the events on that fateful day on September 11, 2001.
Okay, I'm in my jump seat right now.
Okay.
At 3R.
Okay, you're the flight attendant?
Our number 1 has been stabbed, and our 5 has been stabbed. Can anybody get up to the cockpit? Can anybody get up to the cockpit? Okay, we can't even get into the cockpit. We don't know who's up there. Is anybody still there?
Yes, we're still here.
Okay. I'm staying on the line as well.
Okay.
What's going on, honey? Okay, the aircraft is erratic again. Bobbing very erratically. Betty, talk to me. Betty, are you there? Betty?
You've just watched the last minute of the recorded call on that flight, Airlines Flight 11, just before it plunged into the trade tower. Our special guest, Steve Scheibner, was supposed to have been that pilot on that plane. We're going to talk to him in just a minute. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Truth, flexible or permanent? The Bible, ancient history, or powerfully relevant? Culture, a reflection of enlightenment or warning signs? The pastor, commentator, or frontline combatant? Every day, American Pastors Network speaks to these questions where and when they matter. With hundreds of affiliate radio stations nationwide, a website and mobile app screening today's headlines through the twin lenses of the Bible and the Constitution, and a growing network of statewide chapters leading the conversation in cities, small towns, and state capitals. Educating, informing, equipping. This is the American Pastors Network. The time is now to stand in the gap for truth.
Well, welcome back to Stand in the Gap. The focus of today's program is on 9/11 Remembered. God's fingerprints were all over it, though. I want to invite in right now our special guest, Steve Scheibner, pilot, author, father, pastor of many things. Steve, welcome to the program, and thank you for being with us today.
Hi, Sam. It's good to be with you.
Steve, I know as you watched that last 1 minute, we were just commenting on the fact that Betty was your friend. You had a lot of emotions. I know. I don't know how you can watch that. I can't watch it with having a lot of emotion runs through my heart, and you were a vital part of that. Before we get into the emotions of that day, I'd like to just take a couple of minutes and find out a little bit more about Steve, the man. You were and are a pilot. Tell us just a little bit about your pilot experiencing and why it was that you were the one supposed to have been on that flight in the first place.
Well, Sam, I've been a pilot for American Airlines now for coming up on 27 years, and I fly the Boeing 777 now, but back on September 11th, 2001, I was qualified on the Boeing 757 and 767 airplanes, which, of course, were the airplane of choice by the terrorists on that day. And I first got trained by the Navy. They taught me how to fly, and I did 8 years of active duty and then got hired in 1991 by American. And was a Boston-based first officer or a co-pilot. There's two pilots on every airplane. There's a captain and a co-pilot. And I was a Boston-based first officer back on September 11th, 2001, while I was coincidentally at the same time a bivocational pastor. So I had started a church up in Topsom, Maine. I was pastoring that church plant up there. The church was only about a year old, and but paying the bills was my American Airlines paycheck. So it was kind of a neat relationship between the two things. But that's essentially the nuts and bolts of how long I've been with American and what I do for them.
Well, that brings up a question before I turn over to Isaac, because he has a lot of questions for you about the emotions of that day. But you did mention the other part. You were also a pastor. Now, just out of curiosity, I'm wondering, because sometimes God puts us all in different positions. We wear different hats at certain times. Yeah. But as a pilot, you flew planes where you had people's lives in your hands. But as a pastor, you're actually dealing with sheep in the congregation, and to a large extent, you have their spiritual lives in your hands. Did you find the interaction between being a pilot and a pastor contributory to you as a person, Steve?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Sam. I don't know I've ever really thought about it a whole lot, but there is a lot of parallels. And for instance, I'm in the front of the airplane, and the pilot or the pastor typically will be, you think of him as up front in the church, although most of what I do is not just the upfront stuff in the airplane. It's the studying, the knowing knowing the airplane, going to training, all those behind the scene things that you don't see. Most of the work for a pastor is identical for that. It's like you said, you're the shepherd of the flock. And so you spend a lot of time with the sheep, and in a sense, people really look up to you. It's interesting watching people when they enter the airplane. They will take a little peek up into the cockpit, and I always wonder what they're looking for. And I think if I was a passenger just getting on an airplane, I wasn't a pilot, I'd be looking for somebody maybe a little older, a little more mature, maybe a little gray hair. and so you're looking for maturity and responsibility. And then you kind of relax. And I think the same thing is true of a pastor. You look for maturity, responsibility, and somebody that you can kind of put your spiritual life, not completely into their hands, but you can trust them in their leadership. And the same thing would be true of piloting an airplane.
Steve, those are interesting connections between the two. And as we talk about it, you were a pilot and a pastor. But on that day that you were supposed to have been in that seat, what were you doing? How did you find out that the plane, had crashed? And we all remember where we were when that happened, and I remember the emotions going through, the confusion, the chaos really of it all. But for you, being so much closer to it because of the industry that you were in,
Right.
What was that like? Where were you at, and what were you doing when that all came to pass?
Well, sure, yeah. See, September 10th actually is a date that means more to me than September 11th, because in order to do the two things, to be a pastor of a church and to be a full-time airline pilot, I had to bid something that's called reserve at the airlines. Now, reserve meant that I was on call to fill in for another pilot that for whatever reason couldn't make it. Maybe they were sick or they had to go to training. But they always want to make sure there's, you have to have two pilots on the airplane. So there's a cadre of us, about 10% of the pilots that are on call to fill in. So I was on call in order to give me a little more time to be a pastor. When you're on call, you work about half as much, but you still get paid the same. It's a pretty good deal. And so I bid reserve. And on September 11th, I was coming on call. And so on the 10th in the afternoon, I did what I normally do. I went and checked the computer to see if there was any unassigned flying for the next day. In other words, am I going to go to work tomorrow? And sure enough, there was one flight that had not been assigned a co-pilot yet, and that was American Airlines Flight 11 out of Boston to Logan to Los Angeles. And then next thing I do is I look down the list of available pilots, and there was only one guy available to fill in that day, and that was me. So when that's the case, the computer will automatically assign that one pilot's name to the flight, and then you wait for the phone to ring, and somebody, a real person, will call you and verify to make sure that you're going to work tomorrow. And once that phone call gets made, it's a done deal. Nobody can bump you. You can't be, displaced off that flight. On September 10th in the afternoon, I saw my name. I packed my bags to go on the flight. I told my wife I'm going to Los Angeles tomorrow. I even set my alarm clock. And then I waited for the phone to ring. And the phone never rang that night. And it was kind of unusual. But what had happened is I got bumped by another pilot. So I can tell you more about that in a minute, but that's the nuts and bolts of how I originally got assigned that flight.
All right, and so you weren't on the flight, but how did you find out about the attack that had happened through the airlines there? Were you at home, or where were you when you saw this kind of unfolding?
So once I realized that I wasn't going to get that flight, my name had been scrubbed from it at the last minute. The next morning, I didn't want to say I had the day off, but I didn't get assigned an airline trip. So I was doing some Navy work at the time. I was a Naval Reserve officer, a part-timer, and I put my Navy uniform on and went in, and I was actually meeting with the chaplain on base. And I went over at about 8:30 in the morning to my office, and I was coming out of my office, and all of a sudden there's yelling and screaming down the hallway, and I ran down to the captain's office, the guy I worked for, and sure enough, there on the screen, the first airplane had hit the first building. And of course, as anybody remembers from that day, there was a lot of confusion at first. Was it just a small airplane? Was it a big airplane? So we were all kind of huddled around watching the TV, trying to figure out what was going on when we saw the second airplane hit the second building. And at that moment, you realize that we were under attack as a nation, and the base got locked down. So I was on the Navy base that day, really kind of preparing for any sort of contingencies, war contingencies, honestly, that day. And I didn't get off the base until about 7 o'clock that night. And when I finally got off the base and got home, of course, my phone had been ringing all day. Everybody was worried that I was one of the pilots on that flight. We had a little prayer meeting with the folks from my church at my house. When I say little, there's about 65 people at my home that night. And once the prayer meeting was over, I went over to the computer to check and see if I could find the names of the crew members that had been on those flights. And when I brought the computer screen up in front of me that evening, it looked exactly like it did the day before when my name had been assigned to the flight. But instead of my name being there, my name was scrubbed off the flight, and all it said was sequence failed continuity, which at the airlines means the airplane never made it to its destination. And you talk about an understatement. That's unbelievable. And at that moment, it's when I realized that I should have been on that flight. And my wife came around the corner a minute or two later and said, what are you doing? And I said, remember I told you I was going to LA today? And she said, yeah. And I said, that was the first airplane that got hijacked this morning. And it's still hard after all these years to describe that feeling. It's kind of an empty place. We just held each other for a little while. And it's just hard to describe.
So as you were there, here you are, you're the pilot, you're pastor, you're military, and all of these things are coming into effect at the same time as this is what the whole nation is watching. It's a pilot, there's military, they're looking for spiritual help. Could you kind of walk us through maybe some of the feelings that you went through with your family as you started realizing these things? What maybe were the emotions that started to come to you at that point as you started to put the facts together?
Well, you go through a whole range of emotions. You're sad because you know that somebody is having a horrible day, and their life has been transformed forever. Your fellow pilots and flight attendants and their families, and then sometimes you're a little angry. And the overwhelming sensation on September 11th and for the days afterwards was helplessness. I think all of us stood there and stared at that screen that day, helpless to do anything about it. And that's a terrible feeling, because I wanted to go back on active duty. I was so upset, but I realized that I couldn't leave my church. The best thing I had to do was, calm my church and let them know everything was going to be okay, that I wasn't the guy on the flight. And then I wanted to get back to work as fast as I could. So there's a whole range of emotions, but I would say helplessness was probably at the center of it, along with just a sad feeling, and then that's, like Sam had mentioned earlier, that feeling of unity, like people wanted to get together and turning to God, which didn't last very long, but it did last for a little while.
So, maybe you could talk to us as we finish out this segment a little bit about that, maybe some of the sense you had as a pilot, as a pastor, even as a military, in the Navy at the time. Was there a sense of guilt almost that came over you as that was your seat, even as a pastor, feeling like, was there anything more I could have done? And then, like you said, even considering going into active duty again, I think a lot of us would wonder, how did you feel? Was there a sense, that survivor's guilt, I guess they call it?
Yeah, it's interesting. The clip that you just showed with Betty talking to the folks on the airplane was just a 1-minute clip out of a longer documentary called In My Seat. It's available on YouTube, which tells more of my story. But the filmmaker, when we filmed that, asked me the question, did you feel guilty? And yeah, you do have a twinge of guilt with something like that. But I think guilt is most often associated with some form of manipulation. I think if I had manipulated the circumstances not to get on that flight, if I had called in sick and I wasn't, or I somehow gotten out of the flight, I think the guilt would have been overwhelming. But it was a situation, the circumstance was outside of my control. In that case, I think guilt is misplaced. But you do have that sense of, would it have been different if I had been there? And I think the answer to that is obvious. It wouldn't have been any different if I had been there. But you kind of hope, and you relive it over and over again. Every time I watch the film, I relive that day over and over again. And I think, it might have been a different day, but at the end of the day, the helplessness and the twinge of guilt, yeah, they still remain.
I think we can all relate to that, even as a nation, that word you keep using, helpless. That's how we all felt over and over. And so as we go into our break, we're going to come back and talk with Steve more about this. We're going to talk about God's control of every situation, what God was doing, how God worked this out, and looking at the one who is in control of all things, and obviously realizing that there is hope. We're never hopeless with Jesus Christ. So stay tuned. We'll be right back with more of the testimony with Steve Scheibner and the man who should have been in the seat that day.
Welcome back to Stand in the Gap, and I want to continue our conversation right now with Steve Scheibner. Steve, Isaac just went through and just talked with you about the emotions of that day. And I saw on your face even right now, as you say, reflecting back, how can you not be emotional when you recall the death and destruction of that day and the fact that you were scheduled to be on that flight? I want to talk with you now just about another aspect of this, because as a pastor, you stood before your people and you talk to them about the sovereignty of God. I know you preach to them about those kinds of things, how God is in control. When we're sick, God is in control. When there's tragedy, God is in control. In the midst of our prosperity, God is in control. You had to have dealt with that same thought. And I want to know, just explain that a little bit, how you as an instructor, a pastor, speaking to others about the sovereignty of God, dealt with that aspect when it came front and center, and it really came to your mind that you were the guy that should have been on that plane. And without getting into how, because we'll share that, we don't have enough time, we'll do that in the next part 2 of this program. But the realization was God did move you out of that seat, and He moved a friend of yours into that very seat, and he lost his life. How do you take and put that together in a practical sense? Because I know everybody watching the program right now probably has an example or two similar to this, and they've often wondered the same thing. How did you deal with that?
Well, why does God take one and leave another? I mean, how in the world do you fathom that? My brain and your brain, none of our brains are big enough to take all of that in. All I know is this: I was the one that was left behind. And there's an obligation that comes with that. In God's providence, He saw fit to leave me behind. And it's not because I was a better person than the guy who bumped me, or I was going to do more for the kingdom of God. Someday I'll find out. I'll ask God that question. Maybe He'll tell me. But right now, all I know for sure is that I was the one left behind. And there's an obligation that comes with that. You can't just go back to, a normal life, if you will, right? Once God gives you your God story, whatever it is, He creates a platform for you. It's not okay to just kind of go back and say, all right, God, well, I'm just not going to tell anybody my God story. He gives us a God story on purpose, and that purpose is to tell it. And so my God story is on a national platform, and everybody that's old enough, remembers where they were on September 11th. It's a pretty dramatic story. But all of us that know the Lord as our personal Savior have some sort of God story to tell. And it might not be as dramatic as mine, but it's no less important for you to tell it, because there's somebody out there that needs to hear your story. You're a cancer survivor. You're an accident survivor. You've lived through a loss of family members. There's all sorts of things that happen in life that are hard that we live through that give us a platform to be able to share and have empathy with other people and for other people. And so I think that's just a hugely important aspect of all of this. But one of the words that came up in the last segment was helpless, right? And, okay, well, then are we just helpless to not do anything, for God? And I think that helplessness is important, because in our weakness, God demonstrates His strength. So the other question I get asked quite often is, why do you think God allowed September 11th to happen? And again, there's another one where I don't have a definitive answer on that. But I do know that all of us felt weak that day. We felt humbled. We felt helpless that day. And in that weakness and in that humility, what's a natural thing for us to do, or a supernatural thing it's for us to turn to God. And that's what we did. And for me, it became a passion. And so on September 11th, 2001, if you'd asked me, what was I passionate about? I would tell you I was passionate about my family. I've been married to my wife for 34 years now, and we have 8 children. And, with 8 children, you have to be passionate about your family. But now fast forward 17 years, I'd tell you I'm passionate about the American family. And the reason being the American family is in distress. So as I've been searching over the years for a reason that God left me behind, what was the platform specifically He wanted me to fulfill, it would be to reach the American families for the cause of Christ. So my wife and I, Megan and I, have started a ministry called characterhealth.com, and we travel around the nation doing parenting and marriage conferences and seminars and all that.
And Steve, I'm going to have to interrupt you because we're at the end of our program. But ladies and gentlemen, we're going to come back in part 2 of this program and continue with Steve Scheibner. We're going to learn how it was that he actually got off of that flight. And we're going to learn the message that he is actually proclaiming to people across the country. I hope you heard what he said. He felt helpless, yes, but he turned to God. He saw God's power in difficult circumstances, and he used the word duty, obligation, responsibility. When we know the realness and the closeness of God, it should motivate us beyond measure to communicate the truth and the relationship that we have with Jesus Christ. Be that salt and the light. If you're watching right now and you don't know Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, may this be a reminder to come to know Jesus Christ, who is peace and completion.